Hi guys, I hope you're having a great night. I'm going to continue reading from the book called The Haunting of America, and this is called The Devil in Salem. It's a huge book, but I'm just going through the Salem witch trials right now. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so where I left off, it says, in early March 1692, the three accused women were sent to jail in Boston while their fates were decided. The jail's abysmal conditions took the ultimate toll on Sarah Osborne. She died in the dungeon in May. Meanwhile, Sarah Good and Tituba remained imprisoned. Salem Village was now abuzz with fear and worry about those among them who might be witches but were not yet identified. The community seemed on the verge of losing its collective mind, gripped by the terror of demons. March 11, 1692, was a day of prayer and fasting in Salem. It was also the day young Anne Putnam screamed in pain, presumably another victim of witchcraft. Who could be responsible for this newest attack? When Anne Putnam accused a woman named Martha Corey, the villagers were shocked. For unlike the dubious reputations of Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, Mrs. Corey was an upstanding member of the community and church. But Mrs. Corey had made a serious error in judgment when the witch hysteria gripped Salem. Highly skeptical of the afflicted girl's claims, she neither attended court appearances of the accused nor did she want her husband, Giles, to observe them. Word of her inclination to disbelieve the accusations quickly spread through the village. Among some, there were already rumors that perhaps Martha Corey was herself a witch. But still in the community, Anne Church remained incredulous at the very idea that someone of Mrs. Corey's standing might do the devil's work. Before church leaders would consider such an allegation, they thought it best to speak privately with her. However, in advance of confronting Mrs. Corey, the churchman questioned Anne Putnam for further details of what the specter that afflicted her looked like. Anne answered that she'd been unable to witness the apparition's manner of dress because Mrs. Corey momentarily blinded her. When two church officials, Ezekiel Shavir and Edward Putnam, no relation to Anne, arrived at the Corey house, she acted as if she'd been expecting them. "I know what you come for," she said. "You come to talk with me about being a witch, but I am none. I cannot help people's talking of me," Mrs. Corey informed that there had been a complaint made against her. Had the presence of mind to ask what their specter had been wearing. Her tone suggested that she was skeptical of not only the hysteria building in Salem, but of the witchcraft in general. It's also possible that Martha Corey felt she was in a better position than the three women already tried because of her known piety and loyalty to the church. What she seemed to overlook, however, was that those who believed in witchcraft could rationalize even exemplary behavior as the work of Satan. The two visiting officials were ready with a quick retort to Corey's defense. Even witches could steal their way into the church. The men were not unlike others in the congregation. Their suspicions were aroused that she was a witch. On March 21st, 1692, Martha Corey was arrested. Only the day before she'd attended Sunday services in church, disregarding whispers about her because she was certain of her innocence. Also in church were some of the afflicted girls. When they saw Mrs. Corey, they had several sore fits, which did something to interrupt my first prayer, wrote visiting minister Reverend Deodat Lawson, who led the church prior to the appointment of Samuel Paris. This had not been a peaceful weekend for Lawson. On Saturday evening, he'd stopped by the Paris family home. There, he later wrote, he witnessed 12-year-old girl Abigail have a grievous fit. She was at first hurried with violence to and fro and crying. Presently after, she said, "There is goodwife nurse," and said, "Do you not see her? Why, there she stands." Reverend Lawson observed several demonic outbursts that weekend. The one in the church, also witnessed by the congregation, was especially distressing, for it interrupted Sunday services, the most solemn occasion of the week. At another point, Abigail screamed out during worship, "Look where Goodwife Corey sits on the beam, suckling her yellow bird between her fingers." Anne Putnam quickly joined in, claiming she saw a yellow bird atop Reverend Lawson's hat placed near the pulpit. The girls who'd brought the accusations had to be aware that the entire village was watching them, and in awe and anguish. Never before had these young girls, or for that matter, any Puritan children, been the center of such attention. Boys and girls in Puritan society were meant to be inconspicuous. The children were already so frightened and hysterical that they were not wholly responsible for their actions, wrote Dickinson. But these girls were now in an unprecedented spotlight, and with the attention came, as Dickinson explained, an awful power. Of course, only the afflicted girls could see the specter of Mrs. Corey and her supposed familiar, the yellow bird. To everyone else present, the specter was invisible, but to the fearful and superstitious Puritan mind, that had no doubt about the reality of witchcraft and the danger of the devil, it was nearly impossible to believe these innocent children were lying. Could they have fabricated these events? Historians have long disagreed, and there is no way of arriving at an absolute conclusion about their claims. On Monday, Martha Corey faced the magistrates and was interrogated at the meeting house. She appeared self-assured. Her responses were clear. Asked whether she tormented the girls through witchcraft, she answered without hesitation, no. Next, she was asked if she was not responsible. Who was? I do not know. How should I know? I'm a gospel woman, Mrs. Corey answered. The afflicted girls present immediately screamed, gospel witch, gospel witch. Ann Putnam added that now she saw Mrs. Corey's specter and another unidentified woman invoke the devil. I have to say, this is ludicrous. This is insane. I get times were different, but wow. Martha Corey was quick to reply, we must not believe the distracted children. But the girls showed no signs of calming down. At one point, court transcripts indicate that Mrs. Corey bit her lip, likely from the stress and fright of her predicament. At the exact same time, the girls loudly screamed that they were being nipped. As Corey held her hands, so her fingers tightened, no doubt from nervousness, the girls hollered in pain. Then one of them yelled aloud that she saw a black man murmur something to Mrs. Corey. Although whatever specter or apparition the girls claimed to see was not visible to anyone else, their cries and contortions were sufficiently convincing that Martha Corey was ordered to join the 3 other women in jail. The witchcraft hysteria was gaining strength, and the news that Abigail Williams had seen the specter of Rebecca Nurse quickly made its way throughout Salem Village. Many students wondered about the accusation against Nurse. Nothing about her fit their conception of a witch. She was liked and respected, a kind woman with a large and loving family. Her husband owned a considerable amount of land, and they lived on a comfortable farm. But not everyone approved of the nurse's family. Some in Salem were resentful of the nurses' position and influence. What also may have worked against them was that they were private people, not given to excess sociability. Worst of all, the nurses were among the minority of villagers skeptical of the afflicted girls' claims. To many in Salem, that attitude suggested a lack of sympathy for the accursed children. The accusation that the girls had seen Mrs. Nurse's specter was sufficient grounds to bring the elderly woman with poor hearing before the magistrates for questioning. In late March, Rebecca Nurse faced her accusers in the village meeting house. The affected girls were present and displayed their usual fits, contortions, and shrieks, and blamed Mrs. Nurse for causing their agony. As if the girls' accusations weren't enough, Nurse now faced a new allegation from young Ann Putnam's mother, Ann Sr. Both Mr. and Mrs. Putnam swore that Rebecca Nurse had enticed them to wickedness and also hurt the elder Ann Putnam. Mrs. Nurse must have been bewildered by the turmoil and the charges against her, for she protested, insisting she was not guilty. That only spurred the emotionally unstable Ann Putnam, Sr., to angrily hurl more accusations. Did you not bring the black man with you? Did you not bid me to tempt God and die? Mrs. Putnam cried out. Oh, Lord, help me, Rebecca Nurse pleaded. Whether truly hysterical or acting for attention, the commotion that ensued the meeting house approached the surreal. The girls wasted no time demonstrating frightening cries as they threw themselves into more contortions and convulsions. Magistrate John Hawthorne chose to accept the girls' performance as evidence of Rebecca Nurse's guilt. Do you not see what solemn condition they are in? He inquired. When your hands are loose, the persons are afflicted, he said tersely. Hawthorne noted that Mrs. Nurse did not cry. The belief in the 17th century and earlier was that witches did not have the normal capacity to shed tears. Nurse replied that she was deeply affected emotionally as others were. However, she preferred not to display her feelings. The magistrate continued his pointed questioning, the implication being that Mrs. Nurse was guilty unless the girls and Mrs. Putnam were lying. I cannot tell what to think of it, Rebecca Nurse answered. The magistrates again hammered away at the allegation that Mrs. Nurse's specter inflicted harm upon her accusers. I cannot help it. The only matter of village business, the mania became news that gripped the entire Massachusetts colony. Later in April, there were 4 more arrests on charges of witchcraft. Bridget Bishop, Abigail Hobbs, Martha Corey's 8-year-old husband, Giles Corey, and John Proctor's servant Mary Warren, herself one of the tormented girls. The apprehension of Warren raised eyebrows. She'd been one of the afflicted. Why would she now be arrested? Likely she'd been badly shaken by the jailing of the Proctors for whom she'd worked. Her behavior became erratic and confused when she spoke of her own experiences as a victim. When I was afflicted, I thought I saw the apparitions of 100 persons, she testified. But once recovered, she was uncertain if what she saw was real. When the other afflicted girls got wind of Mary's doubts, they moved quickly to squelch her loose talk by claiming she'd also bewitched them, and as well signed the Devil's Book. Mary was brought into court later in April, and it took only a momentary look from her toward the other girls from them to surrender to another round of bits and screams. When Mary was asked how she went from one who was afflicted to now being accused, her answers were somewhat muddled and contradictory. Seeing John Indian and another woman cry, she became emotionally overwhelmed. This was no act on Mary Warren's part. She was genuinely terrified and became so hysterical that she was removed from the court and remanded to jail. Several days later, she was still suffering seizures and admitted to being a witch, but blamed John and Elizabeth Proctor, among others, for his misfortune. By confessing, Mary probably saved her own life. She was freed and again was considered one of the afflicted. Typically, those who confessed to being witches were spared the gallows, even if they admitted to something they'd never done. Those who maintained their innocence were invariably convicted and condemned to Gallows Hill. When Bridget Bishop, Abigail Hobbs, and Giles Corey were questioned, both Bishop and Corey insisted they were not guilty of witchcraft, but their pleas were in vain, for when the accused merely glanced at the bewitched, the girls fell into outbursts of fits and contortions. Abigail Hobbs posed as an interesting case. Unlike the other defendants, she bragged that she had sold herself body and soul to the old boy, a reference to the devil. She told judges that she did practice witchcraft, attended meetings of sorcerers, and drank red wine with red bread. Needless to say, Hobbs was jailed along with the others. During her confession, she implicated no less than 9 more people. Before April was over, arrest warrants were out for Abigail's parents, William and Deliverance Hobbs, Susanna Martin, and Mary Esty, the sister of Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Cloyce, who were already in jail on witchcraft charges. Shaken by her arrest and interrogation by the magistrates, Deliverance Hobbs began to question her own sanity. Could she have been a witch and not realize it? Rattled and overwhelmed, she soon confessed to practicing sorcery and offered names of other alleged victims in the village. Her husband, William, outraged by the courtroom spectacle, insisted he was innocent of charges and that he was a wizard that was sufficient to send him to jail in Boston. Next, Mary Etsy was questioned, and although she remained in control of her emotions, her fate was as the others. She was jailed. On the other hand, Susanna Martin apparently did not take the court proceedings seriously and even chuckled at one point. She doubted the afflicted girls, despite their demonstrations of torment. They may lie for aught I know, she told the magistrates. As she was being taken to jail, she remarked, "A false tongue will never make a guilty person." When a short time later, Esty was freed from the dungeon, her deportment was so impressed officials, even they suspected she was not guilty. But her freedom was short-lived. Whether genuinely fearful or simply malicious, the afflicted girls grew hysterical, especially Mary Lewis, who became so gripped by fits that she was frightened many villagers. When she cried out Mary Etsy's name, the poor woman was sent back to jail. Before April was over, word was that one of the witches was the minister. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed she'd witnessed a specter of clergyman who tormented and attempted to suffocate her, then enticed her to sign the Devil's Book. Who was this diabolical man of cloth? Anne said the phantom identified himself as the Reverend George Burroughs, once a minister in Salem village, who in the past had had a disagreement with a relative of the Putnams. Animosity then grew between Anne's parents and the Reverend, known to have been abusive to his former wives. Burroughs' experiences in Salem village several years prior to 1692 had largely been unpleasant. A member of villagers had not warmed to him. He had difficulty receiving salary owed him, and his wife had died. When Burroughs left Salem, he moved to Wells, Maine, took a position as a minister, and also remarried. But Ann Putnam Jr. certainly remembered him, although he'd been gone from Salem village for some time. Her imagination was apparently in overdrive, or she was genuinely frightened, for Anne now claimed that 2 ghosts materialized to tell they'd been slain by the Reverend Burroughs. The apparitions were those of ministers' late wives, both long passed on. Anne alleged that other ghosts came to her saying the same thing. The magistrates issued a warrant for the Burroughs' arrest, and he was returned unwillingly from Maine to Salem and publicly questioned in early May. Despite being a minister, and possibly because he did not demonstrate sufficient Puritan fervor, he received no leeway or special treatment. Young Ann Putman testified, as did Mercy Lewis, against the Reverend. The girls claimed the Burrows conducted witches' gatherings. Deliverance Hobbs confirmed her friends' versions of events, and others in the village agreed. Reverend Burrows, although physically in Maine, well north of Salem, made his spectral presence simultaneously known miles away in Salem. The testimony against him included the accusation that he induced local witches to bedevil and torment the entire village. He was remanded to jail. In May 1692, the colony had a new royal governor, Sir William Phips. Although he had not anticipated such widespread hysteria surrounding the witchcraft accusations, he knew he needed to somehow deal with what had become calamity. This was now a situation not confined to Salem village. The entire Massachusetts colony was in turmoil. Phips named a special court to bring accused witches to trial and render a verdict in each case with no appeals permitted, and the Chief Justice would be William Stratton from the Boston area, who was also deputy governor. 6 other judges were also named, 4 from Boston, 1 from Salem, and 1 from Haverhill. In June, the first accused witch brought to trial was Bridget Bishop without the benefit of a defense attorney. For her and the others to be tried in this manner displayed an obviously gaping hole in the legal process. Although theoretically the judges were supposed to protect the rights of the accused, this part of their duties was slighted, wrote Alice Dickinson. The defendants received no more consideration than they had in their preliminary examinations. Adding to the general chaos, the afflicted girls, once in court, were gripped by the behavior specters had come to anticipate, twisting in pain, wailing, and groaning, an atmosphere in which the accused had little, if any, chance of escaping a guilty verdict. Why Bridget Bishop, in her 50s, was chosen first to stand trial for witchcraft is not clear. After all, she had not been the first accused. It's possible that her dubious standing in the community may have contributed to her dilemma. Mrs. Bishop, twice widowed, with a successful proprietor of a local inn, and living alone, she stood out in staid Salem village for favoring brightly colored clothing, abhorred by conservative Puritans who traditionally wore dark dress. For years, there were accusations that she was a witch, even by her late husband, and there was suspicion that she practiced image magic. Bishop's presumed supernatural activities, combined with the way she lived, dressed, and prospered, made her an easy target for accusers. If she wanted to further displease the judges, she quickly accomplished her goal. She appeared in court wearing a lace-trimmed scarlet bodice, noted one historian. By Puritan standards, Bishop was a provocative dresser. The evidence against her was mainly gripes by those who blamed her for a variety of problems and ailments, past and present. When women assigned by the court examined Bishop's body, they found an excrescence of flesh, believed to be a teat or a nipple, used by witches familiar to suckle or feed from her breast. She did not help herself when she testified that she was not guilty. I am innocent to witch. I know not what a witch is, Bishop protested. Hawthorne attacked her statement. How do you know that you are not a witch? The judge asked sternly. Bishop could not find an adequate response. Not surprisingly, she was pronounced guilty and ordered hanged. She was executed on June 10th atop the gallows hill. Was Bridget Bishop an innocent victim of hysteria? Clearly, she was a victim, but author Chadwick Hansen reviewed trial testimony and concluded that Bishop had practiced black magic. Hansen found that she and several other women had delved into various types of sorcery, including curses that were supposed to result in sickness, even the deaths of those they disliked for one reason or another, as well as image magic. He also contended that some Salem women practiced white magic, including fortune-telling and divination. Hansen concluded that the afflicted girls were likely victims of hysteria, but their fears were not unreasonable. In the case against Bridget Bishop, several men claimed in court that they once worked in her house and had torn down a wall where they found several small images stuck with pins, wrote Alice Dickinson. If that was true, Bishop had engaged in, or at least dabbled with image magic, a form of sorcery. In Salem, that was sufficient evidence to send her to the gallows. During the Salem hysteria, the belief in the supernatural went to its most dangerous extreme over the question of so-called spectral evidence. In other words, specters or apparitions of witches that tormented and inflicted severe pain on the innocent. But the specters could only be seen by the bewitched. Therefore, the important legal question of the time was whether spectral or invisible evidence could be sufficient to find someone guilty of witchcraft. And what about the contention that the devil might even take the form of someone innocent? That question was also raised by some of the accused. The concept that invisible or unseen evidence could result in guilty verdicts and executions was mind-boggling to later generations of Americans. However, in the 17th century, the rules of evidence had not yet been firmly established. To the detriment of those accused, spectral evidence, unsupported allegations, and hearsay were permitted by the Salem judges. A quarrel, property dispute, or jealousy between angry neighbors could escalate into grief of damage. The bottom line was that so-called evidence against the accused could be highly questionable. What should be allowed to prove someone was guilty of witchcraft? For the judges in 17th century New England, such questions weighed heavily. If one believed witches and wizards were genuine, how was it to be proven? Was there a means in the Puritan system to safeguard both the victims and those wrongly accused? One learned individual of the time was the fiery Boston preacher Cotton Mather, whom some judges consulted for advice on such pressing questions, especially as the Salem trials moved forward. He apparently gave the issue a great deal of thought. Although a fervent few believer in witches and handmaidens to the devil, Mather answered in a letter that provided considerable insight into his thinking on the troubling question of spectral evidence. I must most humbly beg you that you do not lay more stress upon pure spectre testimony than it will hear. Now, first, a credible confession of the guilty witches is one of the most hopeful ways of coming at them. And I say a credible confession because even confession itself sometimes is not credible. Mather also recommended that imposing capital punishment might not always be necessary for some engaged in witchcraft. Other respected ministers throughout the Massachusetts colony were also asked for their input, and there was never any question in their replies that the devil and witches presented a genuine danger and threat to God-fearing Christians. Their suggestions centered only on the means of determining who was guilty of sorcery. They, like Cotton Mather, wanted more than merely spectral or unseen evidence as absolute proof of wrongdoing. But the ministers called on for their advice concluded in a letter that there must be speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious according to the direction given in the laws of God and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the detection of witchcraft. About the admission of the spectral evidence in witch trials, the judges were not of a unanimous opinion. Chief Judge William Stoughton strongly believed spectral evidence should be permitted. He had no doubt, he said, that the devil could take the shape of those who were guilty. Other ministers may have disagreed with some or all of Stoughton's opinions, however, his position was so important that he prevailed. Spectral evidence was allowed when the witch trials continued at the end of June 1692. Also in late June, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds learned their fates. All 5 were found guilty and would be hanged. In the case of Rebecca Nurse, she first been declared not guilty, but the afflicted girls, either acting out of genuine fear upon hearing the verdict or pretending so as to maintain their newly found power, burst into fits, grimaces, screams, and contortions. The nurse was surprised to see Deliverance Hobbs in court as a witness against her. "She is one of us," Nurse cried out in confusion.